The ugly truth about owning and buying vintage audio that nobody is talking about is the subject of today's video. Imagine a time when you could go to the dump and drop off some leaves and limbs and pull out a beautiful 1970 era vintage receiver from the box where they put all the electronics trash in, or going to your local Goodwill and finding a 77 Marantz for $15. Remember those days? Well, they're over. Because in the last 5 years, vintage audio has gotten stupid expensive. Go on eBay and search out Pioneer 1980 and see what you come up with. Now, I'm not throwing stones in glass houses because right behind my shoulder it's a few vintage receivers. Because they're beautiful, they're nostalgic, but they're also dreadful to own and buy. However, if you still want to roll the dice and go vintage, then this is the video that you should watch. Because there's a right way and a wrong way to buy vintage audio, and the right way is not to buy it. Just kidding. So sit down, grab a cup of coffee, and let's talk about the ugly truth about owning and buying vintage audio. This is going to be a lot of fun because I've wasted a lot of money on vintage audio, and I wish this video existed when I got the vintage audio bug, when it bit me and I became obsessed. Because I didn't buy it correctly or have the right mentality when going into it. But hopefully this video can help you out. We're going to talk about why vintage audio is so special to begin with. What the heck happened with vintage audio pricing in the last 5 years. Where I've bought vintage audio. Where I shouldn't have bought vintage audio. A bunch of common stuff that always crops up with vintage audio. How people kind of think about vintage audio the wrong way. And what can and will go wrong. And if you're still glutton for punishment, the correct way to buy vintage audio. The first receiver, something that included a tuner for the radio, an amp section, a preamp section, was the Harman Kardon D1000, released in 1954. And then the TA230 in 1958 was the first commercially available stereo receiver. Before that, hi-fi was basically sold as separates. By the 1970s, though, stereo receivers were everywhere. Marantz, Pioneer, Kenwood, Yamaha, Fisher, you name it. If they made electronics, they were probably making receivers. And they were beautiful. Silver faces, wood sides, different colored lights that lit up the entire tuner section at the top. Some of the most iconic receivers from that time were the Marantz 2270, Pioneer SX1050, Sansui 9090 dB, Yamaha CR1020, and the Harman Kardon 730. These weren't cheap either. The Marantz 2270 sold for about $600 in the mid-70s, which comes to over $3,000 when adjusted for inflation today. A lot of people agree that the golden era of stereo receivers was really from 1970 to about 1982. But what was simple and convenient evolved into a monster. It was a race to the highest power and 70-pound receivers. 150, 170, 200-watt receivers. It was a wonderful time. 5 to 10 years ago, you could go, again, grab a receiver out of a dumpster, go to Goodwill, get one for $10, go to a garage sale, and they would pretty much just give them away. Now, the same unit, even a C-tier company like Realistic, my beloved Realistic, go for hundreds of dollars, sometimes $1,000 on eBay. And the Pioneer SX 1980, $8,000, $10,000. I saw one for $15,000. And in some cases, you're paying $5,000 for a receiver that doesn't even work. So, what happened? Well, nostalgia. And people were locked in their homes for a while and had disposable income. So they started buying everything that they could find. There was a sudden realization that these things were limited. They sounded awesome then. They sounded awesome now, if they work. With the resurgence of vinyl in 2017, people kind of wanted a vintage-inspired system. Social media. There were people showing their vintage receivers, and it was going viral, I guess. And of course, scarcity. People realized that they're not making any more of these. This is it. What they have is it. And then, of course, the junk owners, the people that buy storage sheds, they got savvy to it. Pawn shop owners got savvy to it. Even Goodwill got savvy to it. And what used to be $10 was now $500, or even worse, $5,000. eBay. I've purchased multiple receivers on eBay, none of which have worked out for me. No, I think I have one. It was a realistic that still works. All the rest of them, I think 3 or 4 of them, stopped working in some capacity. Either they dropped a channel, developed a bunch of scratching or hiss. And the problem with eBay is most of the time people selling them aren't really into audio. So they'll turn it on, see if it lights up, and they just assume it's okay. You can get it on Facebook Marketplace, which is just about as reliable as eBay because a lot of people selling them on Facebook Marketplace aren't into audio. If you're lucky, you'll go to an estate sale where people don't really know what they have, and you can get something decent. But again, it's still that age. You don't know. If it came from an older person's estate sale, it probably needs to be recapped. It probably needs a lot of work, but at least you might be able to get it at a reasonable price. You can go to Audio Karma, US Audio Mart, and forums. You have a better chance here because at least it's being sold on an audio platform, hopefully by people that are into audio. But if it works, you're going to pay a premium price. Speaking of premium prices, dedicated vintage hi-fi stores. But even those are a bit of a crapshoot. Skylabs Audio in Iowa. Kevin, my boy, he runs a great business. So if you buy something from him, it's going to work. And I think maybe he carries a bit of a warranty. There's other stores that concentrate on vintage hi-fi, but generally the prices are really high, and sometimes that $3,000 Kenwood has just been sprayed with Windex to make it look all nice. It got detailed, but nothing else got changed. It's like buying a classic car. Some places you go to, they guarantee the car, or at least they've gone over the car with a fine-tooth comb. Other places slap a pretty paint job on it and it's all rusted on the bottom. The takeaway is these things are old, 40 to 50 years old, and most of them haven't been serviced. And most of the people selling them don't know anything about these products. Another expectation I know that I had was that if you buy a vintage receiver, you're going to have the vintage sound. Well, there's no such thing as the vintage sound. It's like a tube amp. People say a tube amp is warm, takes the edges off. Does it? Not really. Different tubes have different sounds. Different companies making the same tube have different sounds. Different amp design has different sounds. Well, the same holds true for vintage. My Yamaha sounds way different from my beautiful Kenwood, which sounds way different from some of the Pioneers I've had. And Macintosh sounds different than Macintosh. They make autoformer amps and then they make other amps and they don't sound the same. So if you are going to buy vintage audio, don't go into it with this is just going to be a warmer, more dynamic sound, because they all sound different. Capacitors. Have you ever pulled out a flashlight that you found in your dad's garage or your grandfather's garage that had been sitting there for about 30 years? Try to get the batteries out. They swell, they get gross, they corrode. The same thing holds true for capacitors. And you will see that in the listings. Recapped, been fully recapped. Well, that's not the only part of a vintage receiver that can go wrong. Power supplies, amp boards, cracked solder, failing transistors, which they don't always make a drop-in replacement for those transistors. Proprietary outputs, IC chips, and that's where the real problem comes in, because in the late 70s and the early 80s, IC chips were used for a ton of stuff in both receivers and turntables. You got switches and controls. You also have proprietary switches like I do back there on the Kenwood, which there's a timer. And if that timer goes bad, well, then you can't get another one. That's why I just leave mine on and I turn it on and off with a smart switch. Not to mention, have you ever looked at a power cord on one of your vintage receivers? It's the thinnest wire that you've ever seen in your life. Now that's probably pretty easy to change out, but I'm just saying, it wasn't always built to last. Okay? They use bad wires. Relays, wiring, cracked insulation, bad joints, oxidized solder. Turntables, especially automatic ones, a lot of them used plastic gearing. And if that plastic gearing gets cracks, good luck. Direct drive turntables also used IC-based speed control. If you're looking to buy a vintage turntable, get a belt-driven one that's completely manual. It's going to be the most reliable. Out of the very few technicians that are out there that still work on vintage stereo equipment, even fewer work on cassette decks and they don't generally make replacement parts for those cassette decks. Snapped belts, hardened pinch rollers, broken clutches, misaligned heads, jammed mechanisms. So if you're getting a huge deal on that Nakamichi Dragon, probably not going to be able to fix it. And the worst thing is, a lot of this stuff works for a while until it heats up, and then problems start happening. And oftentimes those problems can be intermittent. If you're lucky, you swap a fuse, but generally speaking, you're not going to be lucky. Things are going to go wrong. And if you can find a tech to even look at it and their intermittent issues, there's going to be some detective work involved. I live in Dallas-Fort Worth area. There's 7.5 million people that live here, and there's 2 places that I could find that repair vintage hi-fi. One, the guy that looked to be the most reputable, didn't speak a word of English. I had to have Gordo go with me to translate. And that Quad Pioneer receiver I pulled out of the trash, the initial quote was $600 just to start working on it. And he told me that the cost could go up depending upon what he finds. I've got a patron. He goes by Iggy. And last Sunday on the patron Zoom that we have, he was talking about a couple of vintage pieces that he had. And I asked him the question, okay, this thing fails tonight. Tomorrow you need to go get it fixed. Where do you go? He lives in upstate New York, and his response was, well, there's rumors of this guy that can work on this equipment. But I've tried to email him and he's never gotten back to me. I've never been able to contact him. And there's this one other place that may work on it. So his choices are, I might get somebody to be able to work on it, and there's some legendary hi-fi wizard that may or may not exist. A legend of the hi-fi wizard in upstate New York. Repairing vintage hi-fi is like a mythological quest. And even when you find a tech and you have intermittent issues, well, they're not always able to recreate those intermittent issues. I talked to Kevin over at Skylabs Audio, and he told me sometimes they'll have something come in. He has 3 techs that'll all look at it, and none of them can get the problem to repeat. Basically, he said it would take 20 oscilloscopes running at the same time connected to different parts of the receiver, and someone monitoring all of those oscopes for a long period of time, and then have the issue happen to even be able to really define what is wrong with that receiver. A lot of times they'll just replace all the caps, and there's no guarantee that that's going to fix the issue. And the real problem is when the customer gets the repair bill, because it's almost always more than what they expected. And generally speaking, if they can find the problem, it's a bigger problem than they expected. And you have to understand that we have in our brains an expectation of what this stuff should cost. A repair, that is. So if we get a $600 or $1,000 repair bill, a lot of people have sticker shock, and then they take it home and it's still broken, or a new problem crops up. And then there's resentment against the tech because, well, they didn't fix it. And that's why technicians and shops that repair vintage audio are going away. And some places that used to do it don't do it anymore. Kevin told me they don't do repairs anymore. They will repair and service anything that they sell, but they're not taking in anything that they didn't sell. So add that to the consolidation and elimination of service centers, technicians who have retired or are aging out completely, and a lack of new talent that can even perform the job. And even if they could perform the job, they probably won't because there's no money in it. There's one kind of outlier, and that's Macintosh. Macintosh will still service their legacy gear. They have approved service technicians or repair shops, but even those are limited and expensive. Okay, you're not scared away? Well, this is how to buy vintage the right way. Think of it as a classic car. It's beautiful, it's awesome, it's nostalgic. They don't make them like this anymore. They're limited, but stuff is gonna happen. Probably shouldn't use it as a daily driver. If you like to listen to music, well, maybe this should be a secondary system. And if you are going to use it as your main system, you better make sure that you have a mechanic or a technician lined up. The overwhelming theme I got from talking about this last Sunday was that you should probably know of somebody that can work on the product that you're interested in buying before you ever buy that product. And if the mechanic or the technician can see you today, it's probably not the mechanic that you want your car or your receiver to see. The other option is if it turns on and lights up, put it in your rack and then actually use something else to listen to the music, even if you have to tuck it away. If you are buying, make sure you talk to somebody, and if they don't know anything about the history of the product, probably avoid. This is exactly like buying a classic car. If they don't know anything about the history of the product, don't buy it. If you're buying from a junk dealer on eBay, unless you're getting a screaming deal and you know of someone that can fix it, don't buy it. Forums are a little bit safer bet. Audio Karma, US Audio Mart, Facebook groups, people that are actually into it. And if you're buying from a shop, ask them what they did to it. Did they change the caps? How is the power supply? What are the relays like? Does this use a transistor that can be replaced? But if they only say that we cleaned it and it works, you may want to look elsewhere. Vintage gear can be awesome and it can sound awesome. However, having realistic expectations is going to keep you from being resentful at vintage gear. And personally, I've become a bit resentful at vintage audio, and I know some of my patrons have become a bit resentful at vintage audio. But if you're in it for the long haul, if you understand that it's going to break, you're going to have to fix it, and it's going to be expensive, then go for it. You'll be listening, enjoying your music through something that can't be replaced. The last thing is, look at some modern gear that may have vintage vibes. Advanced Paris, Macintosh, but they're super expensive. I think the best bet is to buy something that turns on, that looks pretty, and put it in your rack and not hook it up to anything. If you're still feeling nostalgic, then you need to check out my video on CDs are back and now cassettes. I'll put it right up here. It's a fun watch. So, don't binge watch anything on Netflix or Hulu. Binge listen, maybe through your vintage receiver if it's working, and fill your soul with happiness. And also fill yourself with coffee. I'm making canned coffee now. Well, I'm not making it, I'm sending it to you. Only 8 bags left for Colombian coffee. Next month, it's a new flavor. Link in the description. Thank you so much for watching.